So welcome to this webinar, Families and Relationships in 4 British Cohorts, Measurement Research and Access. And thank you so much for being interested. So I'm Vanessa Moulton and I'll kick things off. Then I'll pass on to Alice Goisis and Alina Pelich, who will highlight some of the examples of some harmonisation work and research in the families and relationships arena using the cohorts. So just before we kick off, a bit of housekeeping. So just to say, we're recording this session, so it will be available online at a later date. The Q&A section at the end won't be included in the recording. If you have a question, please can you use the chat function and note your question will be visible to all attendees. If you have any technical issues, please email us. And finally, we would be very grateful for your feedback. It's really important for us putting together our training program, which we are continually reviewing. So your views are really appreciated. There'll be a link in the chat at the end of the event for a very short survey. So if you could do that, that would be great. Thank you. So this is the outline. We note that some of you are not familiar with the British cohort, so we're going to give a brief overview. Then I'm going to outline a range of family and relationship data, and then how to access the data and types of resources available. Then Alice will look at some harmonisation work on partnership histories and fertility data, and Alina will be looking at some examples of work conducted in the families and relationship arena and highlighting some perhaps ways that the data might be used. And then we'll finish with a Q&A at the end. So the 4 core cohorts we use at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies are the National Child Development Study, and they were born in 1958 in Great Britain in the same week, and the initial sample was 17,500. The second cohort is the 1970 British Cohort Study, again born in 1 week in Great Britain, and again around 17,000 participants. The third is Next Steps, who were born in 1989 and 90, and they're slightly different. That's slightly different from the other 3, as the study began when they were aged 13 to 14 and was initially run by the Department for Education. It's England only and has just under 16,000 participants. And the fourth is the Millennium Cohort Study, who were born in the UK from 2000 to 2002, and there are around 19,000 participants in that study. So just to say, one of the major features of these studies, birth cohorts, is the period they grew up. So what was the historical context when they were born, also during their childhood, adulthood and beyond? And for example, there are differences for the cohorts in education leaving age, social and cultural changes, such as changes in the family unit, marriage, diversity and equality, and then things like economic booms and recessions that they may have experienced, scientific advances, technological changes, health improvements, globalization, and more recently, for example, things like the cost of living. So as I mentioned, we're focusing on 4 cohorts. All the studies are ongoing, and this chart shows you the year on the horizontal and the age on the vertical. And the dots refer to periods of data collection. So the oldest cohort, as I mentioned, is the 1958, and since then there have been 10 data collections, excluding COVID surveys, which I'll talk about in a minute. The last available data collection at the moment is at age 55, and the age 62 to 65 will be available early next year. The BCS 70, so since 1970, there have been 9 data collection periods. The last available at the moment is age 46, and the age 52 to 53 will hopefully be available by the end of the year. Next Steps, from 2004 inclusive, data was collected every year, 7 in total, all until they were age 20, then again at age 25, and the last week was when they were 32, which has become available very recently. And finally, the Millennium Cohort Study, including the first data collection at 9 months, have 7 sweeps and the last at age 17. And as we speak, the age 23 survey is in the field. So just to give you an example of cohorts, this is a brief overview of data collection. And as I mentioned, this is one of our studies, the 1958 National Child Development Study. So in total, there are 11 sweeps of the study currently available and very soon to be 12. In the early sweeps of the study, the main respondents were the parents, particularly mothers. And at age 16 in this study, there was rather more involvement from the cohort member themselves, who became the main respondents from age 23 onwards. This study began as the perinatal mortality study, so the early focus in this particular study was medical. In all the childhood sweeps, there were medical examinations and other information was collected from schools, for example, how the child behaved in school and their examination results. Height and weight has been collected at most sweeps, and a biomedical sweep at age 44, which included collecting blood samples to extract DNA. Cohort members also sat a variety of cognitive and mental health tests in child and adulthood, and there's a variety of linked geographical data as well as available, and consent has been asked for health and economic records. The number of participants, if you look at the bottom, taking part in each sweep is shown below, and you can see that the number taking part has gradually dropped off over time, so in the 9,000s in midlife and around 8,000 for the soon to be available age 62 to 65 survey. In addition to the main sweeps of the studies, as I mentioned, we also have 3 waves of data collection at different stages of the pandemic. And here illustrated is the family and household section of the questionnaires, which includes, for example, household composition, relationship satisfaction, and relationship and family conflict, for example. Our CLS COVID surveys they're unique from most other COVID surveys by the fact that they're actually embedded in the survey, so can be used with all the wealth of prospective information collected pre-pandemic to investigate outcomes during the pandemic, and as we move forward and get new data sweeps post-pandemic. So a vast amount of information has been collected, as I've shown you, about the cohort members across the life course, and the content is multidisciplinary, spans social, economic, psychological, and health, and similar information has been collected in each of the studies, as well as additional information specific to each of the particular cohorts. So there's things like information about the cohort members' parents, details on the birth, health issues, growing up, their circumstances, family, schooling, transitions from education to employment, relationships and parenthood, and measures taken over time, as I've already mentioned, including cognition, mental health, well-being, physical measurements, etc., and also health data, including biomarkers. So also just to point out, there's genotype data, and that's available for cohort members in all of the 4 cohorts. For the Millennium Cohort Study, there is genotyped data available for the cohort member, and also in some cases their biological mother and biological father. And more details about the genetic data can be found at clsgenetics.github.io. And the data access system is fairly quick. And soon to be available we'll have some polygenic scores for multiple health and social phenotypes. Also, with the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, there is a substantive ongoing record linkage programme, and consents have been collected for health and economic data. And in England, the hospital episode statistics are available in all our cohorts via the UKDS secure access, and in Scotland, Scottish medical records have been linked to the BCS 70, NCDS and MCS via the UK Data Service secure access. And in health, there's also health data assets in Wales, which are available from the secure anonymised information linkage. Also education attainment and other records are available for the younger cohorts. And coming soon, we have economic data in England via the UK longitudinal and linkage collaboration. So again, for more information, go to the CLS website. There's a link there, and you'll get more detail on the information. Also, there are user guides and training videos in particular on particular administrative data. So we're now going to have a look at the types of families and relationship data currently available in a bit more detail. And just to say that this is to give you some idea of what's available, and I'd like to put a slight disclaimer in here. There's so much, so if we've missed anything or added something, anyway, we apologise. If you don't see it, basically it doesn't mean it's not there. Whoops. So just to give you a bit of overview on families and relationship data across the life course, so to illustrate what kind of data that's collected at different stages of life. And then I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the specifics. So at each sweep, we collect household composition, so we know who the cohort member is living with, and often their relationship to the cohort member. We also know their partnership histories. We collect parents' marital status, partnership formations, information on childcare. As they grow up, information on their family life, friends and socializing. And in adulthood, the cohort members' partners' relationships and changes, quality of their relationships, and in later years, social and emotional support. And also there's key information on their children, number, and later grandchildren. So moving specifically, so these are the areas I'm going to cover in a bit more detail. So there's family and household composition, familial economic resources, fertility intentions, reproductive histories and pregnancy, parenting and childcare, and other types of relationships. So across all cohorts, as I've mentioned, we look at household composition and family relationships at most sweeps. An important part of the surveys is capturing household composition. So we identify who is in the household, and each individual has their own ID. So in the 1958 NCDS, the BCS 70 and Next Step studies, there is a person grid, which in the more recent sweeps of data is a unique data file, for example, as shown here. And for earlier sweeps, especially in the older cohorts, you may have to look in the main data files of each sweep of data to identify this information. The Millennium Cohort Study is slightly different as it focuses on households, and the information can be found in the household grid. So in each of these files, at the time of interview, as I mentioned, each person in the household is recorded along with their relationship to the cohort member in detail. So for example, if it's a parent, is it the biological parent, adopted, step parent? In terms of partners, and this is true of the cohort member and their parents, is it the spouse? Are they cohabiting? The siblings of the cohort member, are they full, in-law, adopted? The actual children, so are they their own children? Are they adopted? Are they stepchildren? And other members of the household, for example, grandparents, grandchild, lodgers, etc. Other possible information that is available collects sort of movement in and out of the household. So we collect data on when they left the household, including things like death, and when they actually joined the household. There's also date of birth and sex of the person. And this data can be used to create your own bespoke data depending on what area you're interested in. However, there are also key variables. So if that terrifies you, there's derived variables available. We use the household person grids and additional questions which are used to derive family demographic variables, especially at the most recent, it's widely available at the most recent sweeps and cohorts. So the types of derived data that's available are things like number of people currently living in the household, children currently living, whether it's their own children, children of the cohort member's current or previous partner, number of siblings, whether the cohort member's father lives in the household, whether the cohort member's mother lives in the household, etc., etc. So there are lots of derived family variables. So as well as the partners in the household, there is some information on non-cohabiting partners and also romantic relationships in later adolescence in some of the cohorts. We collect information on partnership histories. So we have information on partnership formation, cohabitation, marriage, divorce, dissolution, and formation. And we also have some data sets, which I think Alice, who's following on after me, will discuss the partnership histories data in a bit more detail. We also, as I mentioned, collect information on sex, which is captured at every sweep. We also, in the newer cohorts, collect information on gender identity. We can identify the nature of relationships in two ways. So one through sexual identity questions, increasingly included in the study sweeps, or through the partnership loops, which allow us to observe relationship composition, which are documented in partnership histories, as already mentioned. So we also capture very well familial economic resources. So this slide looks at a range of economic resources the study collects. I know you saw this slide structure slightly previously, but I just wanted to explain how this works. So you'll see, because you'll see many of these types of slides. So on the left, we have the type of information collected. They may not have been asked exactly the same questions or over time or within across cohorts, but this area has been collected. And in each of the columns, we have the study, and in the boxes, we have the age at which the information was collected. The blue age represents the cohort members' parents, and the orange the cohort members themselves. And the information is in detail, so you can look back at it because so you can look back at the information, but we'll give you a broad overview of what's there. So looking at this particular chart, we have occupation, we have earnings, in many cases for both partners and other income, for example, investments, income support benefits, etc. And these are collected pretty comprehensively for each cohort and across the life course. We also have household income and equivalized income in most cohorts and sweeps. And we also collect information on things like wealth, so housing wealth and financial wealth in more recent data collections. So moving on to fertility intentions, this captures the cohort members' intentions to have children or have more children if they already have some, and the reasons why. So here we can see that we have some quite similar measures for the NCDS 1958, the BCS 70, and the next steps studies in adulthood, including intention to have children, number of children they intend to have, and in next steps, reasons why not. The Millennium cohort study are currently a little young to capture this detail, but they will age into these questions. Next, I'll show you some of the measures we use to capture reproductive history. So the cohort studies do well to capture reproductive history, including the number of times pregnant, the outcome of the pregnancy, so for example, whether it was termination, live birth, miscarriage, etc., and timing of these pregnancies. And this is captured for both mothers and fathers in most cases. There are also questions on whether the cohort member used any medical fertility treatment. And also will be, and Alice will be discussing fertility histories in a bit more detail later. We can also identify whether the cohort member has non-resident children, how often they see them, and whether the cohort member's parents and the cohort member themselves as parents contribute financially to the child. So moving on to parenting, there are different facets of parenting, including the relational, joint activities, and health behaviours. So let's have a look at the relational aspect first. So this slide shows some of the dimensions of parenting relationships, capturing both cohort members as children and as parents. They include things like attachment, some parenting beliefs. For example, in the BCS 70, age 16, the cohort members' parents were asked if they would do anything differently in raising a teenager. We have questions on closeness of the relationship between the parent and the child and frequency of arguing with the child, as well as discipline styles, including use of physical punishment. This slide captures some of the ways parents spend time with their children and the activities they do, so including having a meal together, for example, and reading together, and other measures go some way to capture division of labour in parenting, particularly in the older cohort studies. This slide shows some of the health-related parenting behaviours, including whether they were breastfed, or for those with children, whether they breastfed their own children, whether their parents smoked or drank alcohol, and whether they themselves drink or smoke. And there are questions also on drug use, for example, in the next steps and the Millennium cohort study. So next we'll have a quick look at childcare arrangements across cohort and experienced by the cohort member as both a child and as a parent. The type of childcare is collected. So for example, whether they went to a nursery school, a day nursery, had a childminder, etc., and whether they pay for their childcare, and how much and numbers of hours per week. And information on the cohort member as a child is mostly in the Millennium Cohort Study and in adulthood across the other cohorts. So as well as the parent and child relationship, the cohorts also collect information on other relationships. So alongside parenting histories, the cohorts collect information on partner relationships. So for example, partner relationship happiness. There's also information on types of activities partners do in the home, for example, cooking, DIY, laundry, etc. Whether they go out as a couple. And the Millennium Cohort Study, for example, collects information on force in the relationship. There's also information on sexual relationships and behavior not actually highlighted in this chart. So looking at other family relationships, so when the cohort member was a child, some information was collected on siblings. So for example, whether they get on, whether they quarrel, whether they have caring responsibilities for other siblings. And a questionnaire was completed by the cohort member's siblings in the Millennium Cohort Study at age 3 and 5. Also in the Millennium Cohort Study, there's grandparent information on whether they're alive, frequency of seeing their grandparents, and whether the grandparents help look after the cohort member and whether they live close by, for example. Also, there's intergenerational information in midlife about the cohort members' parents and also their in-laws, so whether they are alive, whether they help them in any way, so the types of activities that they might help them with, and the hours spent helping their parents and in-laws. And also in the older cohorts, looking at whether the cohort members have grandchildren, so number and whether they look after them. Also, finally, there's some information on friends. So number of friends, for example, and in adulthood, frequency of meeting up with their friends. So before I hand over to Alicia, I'm going to give you an overview of a few of the resources and where to access the data. So most data is available via the UK Data Service. It's free to download for students, academics, government analysts, and the third sector. And each of the studies has a unique serial number, as shown in the bottom right-hand corner here. And this will take you straight to the study and to the data sets within each study, which they're usefully grouped together. And as we've shown, there's a wide range of data available. The data goes through a process of classification based on sensitivity and disclosure, and is grouped low, moderately, and the most sensitive and disclosive data. And most data has been classified as low level of sensitivity and disclosure and is licensed under an end user license. So in this scenario, your application is authorized directly by the UK Data Service, and you can download directly from there almost immediately. Other data which is under special license is moderately disclosive. So for example, things like geographical indicators or more sensitive information like on mortality data or more detailed physical and mental health information. And the most sensitive data is or disclosive is available under secure access license. For example, the linked health data that I described earlier. And if you want to use this data, you'll need to build in time for approval and training when necessary. And if you want more information on access to more sensitive data or any data, specialist data discussed earlier, we would advise you visiting the CLS website at that link, and that outlines how to download the data. The CLS website has extensive resources as well and information on each of the cohorts. So each of the studies has an overview of the study section of each of the sweeps, sub-studies and documentation, and then the latest research done on that particular cohort. And it's a really good place, I think, to start finding out about the cohorts. There are also introductions to videos on the site if you prefer that medium. And for each cohort, there are the following types of resources. So there's user guides for each sweep. There are technical reports, questionnaires, and user guides for particular data when you download the data, as well as on the CLS website. And we also finally have a training and support page on our website where you can find previous webinars on a variety of topics. So as I mentioned, introductions to particular cohorts, specific enhanced data, other subject themes, for example, mental health, aging, dealing with missing data, and more. And you can search for upcoming events also, and we run a wide variety of events throughout the year. So coming up next is the Getting Started with the CLS cohorts. So look out for that if you're interested in getting a more general overview of the content and data structure and types of analysis. And there'll be training events early in the new year on the new data that I've mentioned in the BCS 70 and NCDS. So now I'll hand over to Elite, who's going to talk about the harmonisation work that's being done.
Okay.
That looks great.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. So my name is Alice Goisis, and I will be talking to you about a stream of work we are currently leading here in CLS on harmonizing partnership and fertility measures across British cohorts. And this work is led by a team which includes myself, Sam Parsons, and Ozzy Billotsten. So the overall aim of this stream of work is to harmonize data related to relationships and fertility across 3 British cohort studies housed in CLS, which Vanessa has just introduced. So the 1958 National Child Development Study, the 1970 British cohort study, and Next Steps, which includes children born between 1989 and 1990. So the purpose of this work is to harmonize variables related to relationships and fertility in order to facilitate cross-cohort research, so research that includes multiple cohort studies to answer important questions on change and continuity in partnership and family formation across several generations in Britain. So in terms of resources, these are the ones that we are developing at the moment. So first of all, data sets. So we are producing data sets that will be deposited or have been deposited on the UK data service. These data sets have the same IDs that are used in the main data sets, so you will be able to link them and merge them with the main study data sets. We'll also be providing code for how the variables in the data sets have been derived. And the code will be deposited on the UK data service or on GitHub or other websites for sharing codes. And finally, we are developing guides or manuals around these data sets explaining how we created the variables, how we derived them, discussing limitations, and so on. And this will also be available on the UK data service and on the CLS website. So first, I will talk about the partnership histories. So first of all, we already have some existing resources. So partnership histories have been derived for the 1958 cohort and for the 1970 cohort. These are available on UKDS, so they are available for you to download and use. And on our website, you will also find the user guides, which explain the variables that are included in these data sets and how they were derived and a lot of other information about this data resource. So for the 1958, we have partnership histories from the age of 26 to the age, from the age of 33 to the age of 55. And for the 1970, we have information from the age of 26 to the age of 45. These data sets include information on the start date of the partnership, the nature of the partnership, if it was a marriage or cohabitation, sex of the partner, if the partnership ended, there is information on the end date of the partnership, duration of the partnership, and how the partnership ended, whether it was separation, divorce, or death. And then for each participant, for each cohort member, we have the number of partnerships across the life course. So we're planning to do more work for the partnership histories. So for the BCS 70 and NCDS, we're planning to provide a data update when the new sweeps become available in 2025. So age 51 for the 1970 and age 62 for NCDS. And we are also planning to produce a similar data set for Next Steps in 2025-2026. So moving on to fertility histories. So in the fertility histories data set, we, for each sweep of data collection and for each cohort member, we are creating the following variables. So whether the cohort member has any biological children, and if so, how many, whether any of the biological children have died. We have a summary information on the number of children in the household, the number of children living elsewhere. We have information on the number of children that the cohort member had with the previous partner, number of boys and girls, age of the youngest, age of the eldest, and the age of the cohort member at when the youngest and eldest children were born. We are also creating variables for non-biological children. So if there is any non-biological child in the household, and by non-biological child we mean step, adopted, or fostered, number of boys and girls, and age of the youngest and age of the eldest. And then we also include some summary information, so whether the cohort member has a partner in the household, their marital status, and whether they have a live-in partner and or any children. And this information so for each sweep of data collection and each cohort member, you will find this information. And then for the last sweep, you will also get summary information like number of children ever had, number of non-biological children, number of biological children ever had. So where are we in terms of this work? So differently from the partnership histories, these data sets are not available for download yet, but they will become available soon. So for BCS 70, we have completed the work. We're waiting for the new sweep of data collection to become available so it can be integrated into the fertility histories. So the full data set has now been derived with variables summarized by each age, and we are currently developing the data guide. We are at a very similar stage for NCDS, so we are currently developing the data guide, and we have started work on next steps, which will include the age 25 and age 32 sweeps. And we are sort of hoping to deposit all these data sets, the codes and the material in the sort of first 6 months of 2025. We have not included the Millennium Cohort study for now because they're too young, but obviously as they get older, the plan is to then integrate the Millennium Cohort study into this strand of work. So before I conclude, I would like to show you some very brief results for BCS 70 using the harmonized fertility histories. So for example, here we see the proportion of cohort members who have any biological child, and as you can see, the proportion is slightly higher for females than for males, especially at the younger ages. And then we see that, as you would expect, the proportion of cohort members who have a biological child, increases for both females and males, and reaches 84% at age 46 and 78% for males at age 46. We can also look at the proportion of cohort members who have any non-biological child. Here we see that the proportion is higher for males than for females, and we see that for both genders there is an increase, especially from age 42 onwards. And then in this graph, we can see the proportion of cohort members who have no partner or child in the household, who have a partner but no children, who have children but no partner, and then cohort members who have both a partner and at least one child. And as you can see, there is a decline in the proportion of cohort members across the sweeps who don't have partner or children, and then an increase in the proportion of cohort members who have children and no partner, as well as partner and children. So this is just to illustrate and give you an example of what you can do with this data. And finally, we can see gender differences in the proportion of cohort members who have a partner and a biological child across the ages for males and females. So as I mentioned, we are planning to deposit the harmonized fertility histories by summer 2025, and that will include depositing the data on UKDS, and this data will have the same IDs as in the main cohorts data, so you will be able to link it and merge it, a data manual, and also a code on GitHub. And for the harmonized partnership histories updates, we are planning to deposit that in 2026. And that's all for me.
Okay, so in the 10 minutes that we have left, more or less, so I'll try to give just a few examples of how the data can be used. And of course, it's a grand task to try and summarize all possible families and relationships related research that has been done using the British cohorts. And that is, of course, beyond the purposes of our webinar today. So I just wanted to say that, just to remind you, as Vanessa said, you know, the data collected can cover different stages of the life course. So there are limitless opportunities for research using relationships and family data. One of the resources that I wanted to highlight, and I'm not going to talk much about the examples mentioned in this chapter, but it's a brilliant chapter that summarizes the contributions of the 1958 and 1970 British birth cohort studies to life course research and family transitions. And it covers a widest range of possible examples how the data has been used to study various life course transitions, such as partnership formation, dissolution, repartnering, and transition to first parenthood, second parenthood, multi-partner fertility, and those are sort of like happening at the earlier stages of the life course, but there's also, as the cohorts gradually age, obviously there's more room for research on becoming a grandparent and sandwich generation and intergenerational care. So a few other themes that I wanted to highlight today, and again, this is just some of the examples of how you can think of combining different aspects of the data and some of the variables that Vanessa mentioned today and some of the histories that Alicia just talked about. So for example, on the slide on the left, you can see a recent paper which is called Educational Gradient of Multi-Partner Fertility, First Estimates for the UK. So just this example just highlights that you can combine the partnership histories that are collected. So this is using the BCS 70, and you can combine the data on fertility and on partnership history to estimate the proportion of multi-partner fertility. If you're not familiar with this term, apologies, it's fertility with different partners. So you can see on the graph, for example, the proportion by age 42, the proportions of childless men and women, those who had children with just one partner, then followed by children with 2 partners, 3 partners, and 4+ partners. So obviously more than one is called multi-partner fertility. So you can see that having children with 2 partners is the most prevalent form of multi-partner fertility, and there are different estimates. You can see on the graph mean and max. That refers to how the births that are occurring outside of co-residential partnership are counted, whether they conservatively and minimally you can count them as they occurred with one partner, or with a maximum estimate that they occurred with different partners. On this slide, you can also see examples of other types of research, and as was mentioned before, with the rise of assisted reproduction technologies such as IVF, there's more research that can be done using the most recent cohorts, and you see an example of a paper using the Millennium cohort study that looks at parent-children relationships and uses some of the variables that Vanessa mentioned, like closeness and frequency of arguing, and compare the outcomes between children who were conceived with assisted reproduction versus those who were conceived naturally. You can also study the changes in family size. So for example, there's a paper on only children and cognitive ability in childhood, and this is a cross-cohort analysis that shows how the cognitive ability of children have changed across the cohorts, depending on the family composition, depending on the changes in the socioeconomic context. Next has been a breadth of research using various cohorts data that looked at how parental separation can influence children's outcomes. And again, these are just the examples of the variety of children's outcomes that could be studied. So for example, there's a paper that looks at children's mental health, on the left, and all of these papers take into account not only whether the separation occurred, but also at what age it occurred, how old the cohort members were, and depending on that, you can investigate whether it had different effects depending on when the separation occurred, and you can look at longitudinal trajectory. You can look at, for example, a paper looking at mental health, internalizing and externalizing problems for boys and girls. You can look at cognitive abilities in families of single mothers, or, for example, another paper that's presented on the slides looks at educational attainment at age 16, and also distinguishes between when the separation happened. So really a variety of various outcomes that you can look for. The family life course trajectories can also be combined with employment life course trajectories, and there's a breadth of data on that that has been collected on employment opportunities and occupation and industry and employment conditions. And these are just an example. For example, you can see a chronogram. So this is a result of a sequence analysis method. So this is an example of a paper where the researchers have combined the partnership and fertility histories with employment histories. So you can see different clusters, different types of work family histories. So, for example, work no family, meaning that sometimes someone has mostly spent the time between ages 16 and 42 in full-time employment, but didn't have a family. Then you have, for example, work and early family, so meaning that someone has worked most of their productive years and started family early, and so on. So this is just a bit of a taste of like how you can use the combination of those variables. The cohorts have been used a lot to study gender pay gap, and in particular what happens after transition to parenthood. So, for example, a paper on the left looks at the work returns after childbirth in the UK, trends, determinants and implications. So it uses the breadth of data on occupation and employment conditions, and how it affected whether women returned to work and how quickly women returned to work in the two cohorts. The next set of examples shows how you can combine family transitions and data on health. So, as Vanessa mentioned, the cohort studies collect a lot of information on health, and you can think about how you want to combine it if that's of your research interest. Some of the examples presented on this slide show how the paper on the right from Demography Journal shows how fertility histories can be combined with biomarkers. And just to say, so this uses the 1958 National Child Development Study, which at the age of 44-45 also collected the blood sample from the cohort members. And so based on these blood samples, there's a range of biomarkers was derived. And for example, this paper looks at whether having children and the timing of having children is anyhow associated with health in later life and with biomarkers in later life. So the graph that you see is just an example of whether age at first birth among men and women is associated with metabolic syndrome. And this is just an example. You can read the paper if you're interested in more. A few other examples on this slide cover how work, family life histories can be combined with BMI trajectories across cohorts. So you can also track like whether, for example, earlier parenthood or later parenthood is anyhow associated with BMI trajectories early and later in life. And the paper on the top left corner looks at mental well-being differences in cohabitation and marriage and the role of childhood selection. So you can also investigate whether having a partnership or partnership history is anyhow associated with mental health and well-being. As Vanessa said, we collected a lot of data during COVID, and this data could also be used for and has been already used to study, to look at various effects on families. So, for example, the paper on the left looked at changes in household composition across cohorts and couples' relationship quality and how it increased, decreased depending on the household composition and depending on the age of the cohort members and the social support during lockdown. So really a breadth of data there. You can see another example of how change in living arrangements and stress during COVID lockdown, evidence from 4 birth cohorts in the UK that also looked at how the change in living arrangements, so whether someone had to move in back with their families or on the contrary had to stay further away, and various other changes in living arrangements, how that is associated with markers of stress. And the example on the top right corner is the paper which is called Parental Perceptions of Learning Loss During COVID-19 School Closure in 2020. And this is the graph is just an example of one of the many parameters of time use that was collected in the studies. So the graph, for example, shows the times that parents spent homeschooling children by key stages and parent gender. And overall, the paper discusses the differences in parental perception of learning loss depending on the year group, depending on the school type, depending on various time use arrangements and household distribution of labor. So really a breadth of data that can be and has been used to study effects of COVID. I'm not going to go through all of it, but you can see that the media usually picks up on various studies that have been conducted using the cohort data, and a lot of it is related to families, so research on breastfeeding, research on parental age, research on cognitive abilities and development of children, depending on the type of families they grow up with. Really, the opportunities are limitless. And just to highlight as my last slide that the next steps age 32 data is now available and has been deposited on the UKDS. And the most recent sweep has a lot of special features, interesting features that I highly recommend you check out. We have a series of webinar series, a very short webinar series that highlights various aspects of the data. But you can see, put on the slides, that there are now pregnancies and fertility histories available for this cohort, and the childhood circumstances and fertility intentions. So really have a look and see whether you can, that can somehow fit your research agenda. And I think I'm going to stop sharing now.